Salzburg Christmas market that their lives were about to change forever. But just as she reached for her phone, a mystery call flashed on the screen, its anonymous number promising secrets too tempting to ignore. Who else knew about the pregnancy? And why were they so desperate to reach her? As whispers of deception and betrayal began to unravel her carefully crafted life of luxury, Eliza faced an impossible decision. Her past threatened her future, and each choice she made could tear her world apart. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The rain hammered against the windshield of Eliza Bennett's 15-year-old Honda Civic, the wipers struggling to keep up as she pulled into the parking lot of Westlake Medical Center. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from the cold that had seeped through her thin jacket, but for what the doctor had just confirmed over the phone. Pregnant. The word hung in the air of her car like a ghost. Not just pregnant, carrying triplets. She pressed her forehead against the cool steering wheel and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to cry, counting each one in her head as tears mingled with mascara, creating dark rivulets down her cheeks. 30. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, smearing makeup across it. The jacket was a gift from Marcus. Marcus Harrington III, heir to the Harrington Development fortune, her fiancé of 8 months, the man whose children were now growing inside her. They had been together for 3 years. 3 years of private jets to Paris for the weekend, of champagne that cost more than her monthly rent, of promises whispered against her skin in the dark. 3 years of her believing she had escaped the cycle of struggle that had defined her childhood in South Boston. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her entire life fighting to escape poverty. Her mother had cleaned houses for Boston's elite while raising 3 children alone after their father disappeared one winter night, presumably to escape his mounting gambling debts. Eliza had worked 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school, had clawed her way into a position at Westlake, one of the city's most prestigious hospitals. It was there she had met Marcus when he came in with a sprained wrist after a squash accident. He had asked for her number before she had even finished wrapping his wrist. And now here she was, sitting in a hospital parking lot, pregnant with triplets, about to tell the man who had proposed to her beneath the twinkling lights of the Eiffel Tower that he was going to be a father 3 times over. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, attempting to repair the damage her tears had caused, then reached for her phone. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring. Eliza. His voice was clipped, distracted. She could hear voices in the background, the clink of glasses. He was at lunch with clients, most likely at Soleil, the French restaurant downtown where a single entree cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "I need to see you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's important." There was a pause. "Can it wait until tonight? I'm in the middle of something." "No," she said, surprised at her own firmness. "It can't." Another pause, longer this time. She could almost see him running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, the way he did when he was annoyed. "Fine. I'll be at the penthouse in an hour." The call ended before she could respond. The penthouse. Not their home, not the place they shared, but his possession. It had always been like that, she realized as she started the car. Everything was his. The penthouse overlooking the harbor, the summer house in the Hamptons, the art collection, the staff. Even the engagement ring on her finger, a 5-carat diamond that felt suddenly heavy, belonged to the Harrington family, not to her. The drive to Beacon Hill took longer than usual, the rain slowing traffic to a crawl. By the time she handed her keys to the valet at Marcus's building, Jorge, who always greeted her with a smile and asked about her work at the hospital, her nerves had frayed to breaking point. The elevator ascended silently to the top floor, where Marcus owned the entire level. He was waiting for her when she stepped into the marble-floored foyer, still dressed in his business suit, a glass of scotch in his hand. He didn't move to greet her, didn't kiss her the way he usually did. Something cold slithered down her spine. "What's so urgent?" he asked, taking a sip from his glass. She removed her wet jacket. "Fine time. I want a doctor today." His expression changed, concern flickering across his features. "Are you sick?" "No." She took a breath, then plunged ahead. "I'm pregnant." The glass in his hand stilled halfway to his mouth. For a long moment, he didn't speak, didn't move. Then, carefully, he placed the glass on the sleek console table beside him. How is that possible? You're on birth control. It failed. It happens sometimes. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the perfectly regulated temperature of the penthouse. There's more. It's triplets. Marcus laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the space between them. You're joking. No, I'm not. I have the ultrasound pictures if you want to see them. He turned away from her, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor. The rain lashed against the glass, distorting the view of the city beyond. When he spoke again, his voice was distant, as if he were talking to himself rather than to her. This isn't happening. Not now. She moved toward him, confusion and unease growing with each step. I know it's a shock. It was for me too. But we're getting married in 3 months. We'll just have to adjust our plans. He turned to face her, and the expression on his face stopped her cold. It wasn't shock or confusion or even anger. It was calculation, the same look he wore when negotiating a difficult business deal. Eliza, he said, his voice gentle now, controlled. We need to be practical about this. Practical, yes. He moved toward her, taking her hands in his. His were cool and dry. Hers were trembling. You're 28 years old. You have your career at the hospital. You're not ready to be a mother to 1 child, let alone 3. She pulled her hands away, a sick feeling growing in the pit of her stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying there are options. I can arrange everything. The best doctors, complete privacy. No one would ever have to know. The realization of what he was suggesting hit her like a physical blow. You want me to get rid of them? I want us to consider all our options, he corrected, his tone reasonable, as if they were discussing which restaurant to dine at rather than the lives growing inside her. This wasn't part of our plan. Plans change, she said, her voice rising. Life changes. I thought you'd be shocked, maybe even scared. I know I am, but I never thought you'd suggest. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring herself to say the words. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair, that gesture she knew so well. My father is retiring next year. I'm taking over as CEO. The board is watching every move I make. The Harrington name means something in this city, Eliza. We have responsibilities, expectations to uphold. And a baby, 3 babies, don't fit into those expectations? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not right now, no. He moved back to where his drink sat, picked it up, took a long swallow. Maybe in a few years, when I've established myself at the company. When we're ready. I'm ready now, she said, surprised at the certainty she felt. These are our children, Marcus. His expression hardened, the mask of reasonableness slipping. You're being emotional. This isn't what we planned. Think about what you're saying. 3 children at once? How would you even manage? You'd have to give up your career, everything you've worked for. We'd manage together, she said, though a small voice in her head whispered that he was right. How would she cope with triplets? The medical costs alone would be staggering, even with insurance. The logistics of caring for 3 infants simultaneously seemed impossible. But they were hers. Already, fiercely, she loved them. Marcus was watching her, his expression softening as he saw the conflict on her face. He placed his glass down again and moved toward her, pulling her into his arms. She allowed it, needing the comfort of his embrace even as doubt gnawed at her. We'll figure this out, he murmured against her hair. Together. Just give me some time to think. She nodded against his chest, relief washing over her. He hadn't rejected the idea outright. He just needed time to adjust to the news, to plan, the way he always did. Everything would be okay. It wasn't until 3 days later, when she returned from a 12-hour shift at the hospital to find her belongings packed in boxes in the penthouse foyer, that she realized how wrong she had been. Marcus wasn't there. Instead, his father's personal attorney, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had always regarded her with thinly veiled contempt, stood waiting for her. Miss Bennet, he said, his voice as cold as the marble beneath their feet. Mr. Harrington has asked me to inform you that your relationship has come to an end. He feels you're not compatible in your life goals. She stared at him, unable to process the words. "What are you talking about? Where's Marcus?" "Mr. Harrington has left for London on business. He felt it would be easier this way." The attorney held out an envelope. "This contains a generous settlement offer, contingent upon your discretion and cooperation." Her hand shook as she took the envelope, opening it to find a check for $500,000 and a legal document releasing Marcus from any paternal obligations or responsibilities. The message was clear: take the money, get rid of the babies, and disappear. "Get out," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. The attorney raised an eyebrow. "Miss Bennett, I advise you to consider the offer carefully. Mr. Harrington is being extremely generous under the circumstances." "Get out," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "Get out, or I swear I'll call the police and tell them you're trespassing." The attorney sighed, placing a business card on top of one of the boxes. "When you've calmed down, call me." The offer has an expiration date. After he left, Eliza sank to the floor among her boxed-up life, the check and contract still clutched in her hands. She had never felt so alone, so betrayed, so utterly abandoned. She thought of her mother, who had raised 3 children by herself, working herself to exhaustion every day. Was that to be her fate as well? She placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "We'll be okay," she whispered, not sure if she was trying to convince the tiny lives inside her or herself. "Somehow we'll be okay." The next 7 months were a study in survival. Eliza moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, far from the luxury of Beacon Hill. She continued working at the hospital for as long as she could, saving every penny, preparing for the astronomical costs that would come with the birth of triplets. Her pregnancy was classified as high risk from the start, requiring frequent doctor visits, specialized care, and eventually bed rest for the final 6 weeks. Through it all, Marcus remained silent. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement of what he had done or of the children he had abandoned. She heard about him through hospital gossip. He was engaged again to the daughter of a shipping magnate, a strategic alliance that would expand Harrington Development's reach into Asian markets. The wedding was set for the spring, barely a year after he had planned to marry Eliza. Her water broke at 34 weeks, earlier than her doctors had hoped, but not unexpected with triplets. She called an Uber to take her to the hospital, clutching her hastily packed bag, fear and anticipation warring within her. 20 hours of labor later, Sophia, Oliver, and Emma Bennett entered the world, tiny but perfect, each weighing just over 4 pounds. Looking at their small faces, their miniature fingers and toes, Eliza felt a love so profound it physically hurt. She also felt terror unlike anything she had ever known. How would she do this alone? How would she provide for them, protect them, give them the life they deserved? The triplets spent 3 weeks in the NICU, growing stronger each day. Eliza practically lived at the hospital, learning how to care for her premature babies, how to feed them, bathe them, recognize their individual cries. The nurses, her colleagues, her friends, rallied around her, offering advice, support, and occasionally a shoulder to cry on when the enormity of her situation overwhelmed her. When the day came to take them home, Eliza felt like she was stepping off a cliff into the unknown. Her mother had flown in from Florida, where she had retired 2 years earlier, to help for the first month. It was a blessing, but also a reminder of how precarious their situation was. The medical bills had already depleted most of her savings, despite her insurance. The cost of formula for 3 babies, diapers, clothing, and equipment was staggering. She had calculated that she could stay home with them for 6 months using what remained of her savings and the generous leave policy at the hospital. But after that, she would have to return to work. The reality of raising triplets alone was even harder than she had imagined. The babies operated on different schedules, meaning she rarely slept more than an hour at a stretch. When one stopped crying, another started. Feeding time was a logistical nightmare. By the time her mother had to return to Florida, Eliza was running on empty, surviving on coffee and determination. She found a rhythm eventually, a way to cope with the relentless demands of 3 infants. She learned to sleep when they slept, to feed 2 at once while the third waited in a bouncer, to change diapers with mechanical efficiency. She learned to silence the voice in her head that whispered she couldn't do this, that she was failing them, that they deserved better. The babies grew, thrived, developed their own personalities. Sophia was serious and observant, watching the world with solemn dark eyes. Oliver was active and demanding, always the first to cry when hungry or uncomfortable. Emma was sweet-natured and easy, smiling early and often. They looked like Marcus. All three had his dark hair and olive skin, though Sophia had Eliza's green eyes while the other two had their father's brown ones. When they were 5 months old, Eliza received a package at her apartment. Inside was a copy of Boston Magazine, open to a spread featuring Marcus's wedding to Victoria Chun, heiress to the Chun shipping fortune. The accompanying note, unsigned but clearly from the Harrington family attorney, was brief, a reminder of the discretion clause in your agreement. The offer remains open. Eliza threw the magazine and note into the trash, then spent the next hour holding her babies one by one, whispering promises against their soft heads that she would never abandon them, never choose money or convenience over them, never make them feel unwanted or unworthy. The next week, she returned to work, leaving the triplets at a daycare that consumed nearly 2/3 of her salary. She worked extra shifts whenever she could get childcare, took on overtime, lived on ramen and canned soup so her children could have fresh fruit and vegetables. She was perpetually exhausted, perpetually worried about money, perpetually guilty for the time she spent away from her babies. But they were growing, healthy, and beautiful. By their first birthday, all three were walking, babbling, developing distinct personalities that amazed and delighted her. Sophia was cautious and thoughtful, studying a new toy before deciding how to play with it. Oliver was fearless, climbing anything he could reach. Emma was social and affectionate, distributing hugs and sloppy kisses with generous abandon. Eliza threw them a small party in the local park, inviting a few friends from work and the mother she had met at the library's baby reading group. As she watched her children smash cake into their faces, laughing and covered in frosting, she felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to her eyes. They had made it through the first year against all odds. They were not just surviving, but thriving. That night, after she had bathed the sticky cake from their hair and put them to bed, she allowed herself a rare glass of wine and a moment of reflection. Her life was nothing like she had imagined it would be a year ago. She had lost the man she thought she would spend her life with, the financial security she had believed was hers, the career advancement she had worked so hard for. But she had gained these three miraculous beings who filled her heart in ways she had never thought possible. She was making it work, one day at a time. And that, she decided as she raised her glass in a silent toast to herself, was something to be proud of. 4 years passed in a blur of firsts. First words, first steps, first days of preschool. The triplets grew from babies to toddlers to preschoolers, developing into distinct individuals who shared an unbreakable bond with each other. Eliza worked and saved and scrimped, providing a life that was modest but stable, filled with love, if not luxury. She had been promoted at the hospital, moving into a management position that offered better pay and more regular hours. They had moved to a slightly larger apartment in a better neighborhood, with a small playground nearby where the children could play. She had even started dating occasionally, though nothing serious. Her children and her job left little time or energy for romance. It was a Saturday morning in early autumn when their carefully constructed world collided with the one Eliza had left behind. She had taken the triplets to the Boston Children's Museum, a rare treat funded by her recent bonus at work. They were in the art room, the children happily painting at easels, when she heard his voice. "Eliza?" She froze, her hand stilling on Emma's shoulder where she had been adjusting her smock. Slowly, she turned, knowing what she would see but hoping desperately she was wrong. Marcus stood a few feet away, staring at her with an expression of shock. He looked exactly the same, impeccably dressed in casual weekend attire that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his dark hair still perfectly styled, his face unlined despite the years that had passed. Beside him stood a petite Asian woman in designer jeans and a silk blouse, holding the hand of a little boy about the same age as the triplets. Time seemed to stop as they stared at each other, the noise of the museum fading to a distant hum. Then Oliver tugged at her sleeve, breaking the spell. "Mommy, look at my painting." She tore her gaze from Marcus to look at her son's artwork, a chaotic splash of colors that he proudly declared was a dinosaur. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. When she looked up again, Marcus was moving toward them, his wife and son trailing behind. His eyes moved from Oliver to Sophia, who was meticulously adding details to her painting, to Emma, who had abandoned her easel to watch the unfolding scene with curious eyes. "These are," he began, then stopped, his voice failing him. "My children," Eliza finished for him, her arm instinctively moving to gather Emma closer to her side. "Sophia, Oliver, and Emma." His eyes widened as he took in the triplets more fully, recognition dawning as he saw his own features reflected in their small faces. "You kept them," he said, his voice barely audible. "Of course I kept them," she replied, a spark of anger flaring through her shock. "They're my children." His wife had caught up to him now, her expression curious but not unfriendly. "Marcus? Who is this?" He seemed unable to speak, still staring at the triplets with an expression Eliza couldn't decipher. Was it regret? Salt? Anger? Whatever it was, she didn't care. She had spent 4 years building a life without him, protecting her children from the knowledge that their father had considered them an inconvenience to be disposed of. "I'm an old friend," she said to his wife, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. From the hospital, understanding dawned in the woman's eyes, and Eliza realized that Marcus had told her about the nurse he had dated before her. How much had he shared? Did she know about the pregnancy, the abandonment, the money he had offered to make it all go away? "I'm Victoria," the woman said, extending a hand that Eliza reluctantly shook. "And this is our son, Ethan." The little boy looked up at the mention of his name, and Eliza saw that he was the spitting image of Marcus, with the same dark eyes and serious expression. He was only a few months younger than her children, she realized. Marcus must have gotten his new wife pregnant almost immediately after their engagement. "Nice to meet you," Eliza said automatically, years of social conditioning taking over despite the surreal nature of the encounter. "These are my children, Sophia, Oliver, and Emma." Victoria's eyes widened slightly as she looked more closely at the triplets, perhaps noticing the resemblance they bore to her husband and son. If she made the connection, she gave no sign of it, merely smiling and saying, "What a handful 3 must be. We find 1 challenging enough." "We manage," Eliza said, fighting the urge to gather her children and flee. They deserved better than to be hustled away like a shameful secret. "We should finish up here, though. We have plans for the afternoon." Marcus finally seemed to recover his voice. "Eliza, could we talk? Just for a moment." She hesitated, looking at her children. Sophia had finished her painting and was watching the adults with that observant gaze that missed nothing. Oliver was still absorbed in his artwork, adding more and more paint to his already saturated paper. Emma was pressed against her side, suddenly shy in the presence of strangers. "Victoria, why don't you take Ethan to see the Bubbles exhibit?" Marcus suggested, his tone casual but his eyes pleading with his wife. "We'll catch up in a minute." Victoria glanced between them, a flicker of something, suspicion, hurt, curiosity, crossing her face before she nodded. "Of course. Come on, Ethan. Let's go see the big Bubbles." As they walked away, Marcus turned back to Eliza, his expression troubled. "You never cashed the check," he said. Of all the things he could have said, this was so unexpected that Eliza laughed, a short, harsh sound that drew curious glances from nearby parents. "That's what you want to talk about?" "The money." He had the grace to look ashamed. "No, I'm just surprised. You could have used it." "For what? To ease your conscience? To buy my silence?" She shook her head, disgust rising in her throat. "I didn't want your money, Marcus. I wanted you to be a father to your children." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I wasn't ready," he said, his voice low. "I panicked. I was selfish and cowardly, and I've regretted it every day since. Have you? She asked, genuinely curious despite herself. You seem to have moved on quite nicely. New wife, new child, new life. His gaze dropped to the children, who were now all watching him with varying degrees of interest. They're beautiful, he said softly. They look like you, she finished for him. Yes, they do. Especially Oliver. At the sound of his name, Oliver looked up. Who's that, Mommy? He asked, pointing at Marcus with a paint-covered finger. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 4 years of absence, of unasked questions, of a void in 3 young lives. Eliza could tell them the truth right now, could shatter the careful narrative she had constructed about a father who had to go away before they were born. She could watch Marcus's carefully reconstructed life implode as his wife realized the full extent of his betrayal. But looking at her children's innocent faces, she knew she couldn't do it. Not here, not like this, not to satisfy a desire for revenge that she had thought long buried. This is Mr. Harrington, she said carefully. He's someone I used to know. Marcus's expression was a mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment. Had he wanted her to tell them? Did he want to be a part of their lives now, after 4 years of silence? It's nice to meet you all, he said, crouching down to their level. Your mom and I worked at the same hospital a long time ago. Sophia, ever perceptive, studied him with those green eyes that were so like Eliza's. You look like Oliver, she said simply. Marcus froze, his eyes darting to Eliza in panic. She stepped in smoothly, years of practice at handling difficult questions come in her aid. Lots of people look a little bit like each other, sweetheart. Remember how Mrs. Kelly said Emma looks like that girl in her class, Zoe? Sophia considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Marcus stood up, visibly shaken by the near miss. Eliza, I'd like to talk more. Privately. Could we meet somewhere? She hesitated, torn between the desire to tell him exactly what she thought of him and the curiosity about what he could possibly have to say after all this time. I don't think that's a good idea, she said finally. Please, he said, lowering his voice. I know I don't deserve your time or consideration, but there are things I need to say to you. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the confident, privileged man who had cast her aside when she became inconvenient, but someone haunted, someone carrying a burden he couldn't put down. Despite everything, she felt a flicker of pity. Fine, she said, pulling out her phone. Give me your number. I'll text you when I can arrange childcare. He recited his number, which she entered into her phone with steady fingers. I should go, he said, glancing toward where Victoria and Ethan waited by the bubble exhibit. Thank you. As he walked away, Emma tugged at her sleeve. Mommy, can we go see the bubbles too? Eliza looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and managed to smile. Of course we can, baby. Let's wash those hands first, okay? As she helped her children clean up at the sink, she watched Marcus rejoin his wife and son, saw Victoria say something to him, saw him shake his head in response. What was he telling her? That Eliza was just an old colleague, someone he barely remembered? Or was he confessing the truth? It didn't matter, she told herself as she led her children toward the bubble exhibit, carefully timing their arrival to coincide with Marcus's family's departure. Her children were happy, healthy, loved. They didn't need Marcus or his money or his belated regrets. They had everything they needed in her. But as she watched Sophia's face light up with wonder as she created a giant bubble, as Oliver chased smaller ones across the room with delighted shrieks, as Emma carefully studied the wands and solutions with scientific curiosity, she couldn't help but wonder what might have been. What kind of father would Marcus have been if he had chosen differently? What kind of life would they have had as a family? Questions without answers, possibilities lost to time and choice. She pushed them aside, focusing instead on the reality before her. 3 beautiful children who were wholly and completely hers, a life built on her own terms, a strength she had never known she possessed until it was tested by fire. Whatever Marcus wanted to say to her, it couldn't change the past. But as she watched her children play, Eliza realized that perhaps, for their sake if not for hers, she needed to hear it. The coffee shop was busy with the Saturday morning rush, but Eliza had arrived early enough to secure a quiet table in the corner. She cradled her latte between her hands, drawing comfort from its warmth as she waited. The triplets were spending the morning with her friend Sarah, a fellow nurse whose daughter was in the same preschool class as Sophia and Emma. She had told them she had a meeting for work, the lie sitting uncomfortably on her tongue, but necessary. How could she explain to 4-year-olds where she was really going, who she was really meeting? Marcus arrived exactly on time, scanning the cafe until his gaze landed on her. He looked different today, more casual in jeans and a sweater, his hair slightly rumpled as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. He ordered at the counter before joining her, sliding into the seat across from her with a murmured thanks. For a moment, neither spoke, the noise of the cafe filling the silence between them. Eliza studied him, noting the faint shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. He looked like a man under strain, though whether from their unexpected encounter or something else, she couldn't tell. "Thank you for meeting me," he said finally, his voice low. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. The barista called his name, and he rose to retrieve his coffee, returning with a paper bag as well. "Blueberry scone," he said, pushing it toward her. "You used to love them." The gesture, so casual yet so intimate, a reminder of a time when he had known her preferences, her habits, her heart, caught her off guard. "I still do," she admitted, taking the bag but not opening it. "But that's not why we're here." He took a sip of his coffee, perhaps to gather his thoughts. "No, it's not. Eliza, I don't even know where to begin. What I did to you. There's no excuse, no justification." "You're right, there isn't," she agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I didn't come here for an apology, Marcus. It's been 4 years. What do you want?" He set his cup down carefully. "I want to make things right." She laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Right? How exactly do you propose to do that? You can't undo the last 4 years. You can't take back what you did." "I know that," he said, his expression pained. "But I can take responsibility now. I can provide for them, be part of their lives." Her hands tightened around her cup. "Part of their lives," she repeated. "You mean now that they're past the difficult baby stage, now that they're walking and talking and toilet trained, now that the hard part is over, you want to swoop in and play daddy?" He flinched at her tone, but didn't look away. "I deserve that. I deserve your anger and contempt. But this isn't about me, or even about you. It's about them. They deserve to know their father. Their father abandoned them before they were even born," she said, fighting to keep her voice down. "Their father offered to pay for their non-existence. Why should they know that man?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Because I'm not that man anymore. Because I've spent 4 years regretting the biggest mistake of my life. Because they're my children too, and I want to be in their lives if you'll let me." Eliza studied him, searching for the truth in his words. Was this genuine remorse, or was something else driving his sudden interest in fatherhood? "What does Victoria think about all this?" she asked. "Does she even know?" He hesitated, and she had her answer. "I haven't told her yet. About the triplets, I mean. She knows about our relationship, of course, and that it ended badly. But not about the pregnancy." "How convenient," Eliza said coldly. "So what's your plan? Secret visits with your secret children while your wife believes you're working late? Financial support that you hide in offshore accounts? Or were you thinking more along the lines of tearful confession, forgiveness, and one big, happy blended family?" He had the grace to look ashamed. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't thought it through. Seeing them at the museum, it was a shock. They're so beautiful, so perfect. And when Sophia said I look like Oliver..." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "It hit me all at once, what I've missed, what I threw away. And now you want it back," she finished for him. "Just like that." "Not just like that," he said, reaching across the table as if to take her hand, then thinking better of it when he saw her expression. "I know it will take time. I know I have to earn your trust, their trust. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But please, Eliza, at least consider it. For their sake." She sat back, considering his words. She had spent countless nights imagining this conversation, rehearsing what she would say if Marcus ever reappeared in their lives. In her imagination, She had been coldly dismissive, or righteously furious, or clinically detached. She had never imagined feeling this confusion, this uncertainty. "They've asked about their father," she said finally, the admission costing her more than she wanted him to know. "Not often, but sometimes. I've told them that you had to go away before they were born, that you couldn't be with us, but that doesn't mean you didn't love them." Marcus's eyes filled with tears, surprising her. In 3 years together, she had seen him cry only once when his grandmother died. "Thank you," he whispered, for not making me a villain in their eyes. "I did it for them, not for you," she said. "Children need to believe they're loved, even by absent parents. Especially by absent parents." He nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying, that she knew this from experience, that her own father's abandonment had left scars that had never fully healed. "What if we start slowly?" he suggested. "I'll tell Victoria everything, I promise. And then maybe I could see them occasionally. Get to know them. Let them get to know me. No pressure, no expectations. Just building a relationship." Eliza considered his proposal, weighing the potential benefits against the risks. Her children deserve to know their father, yes. But they also deserve to be protected from further hurt, from the possibility that Marcus might decide once again that fatherhood was too inconvenient, too complicated, too demanding. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it has to be on my terms. You don't get to dictate the timeline or the terms of your involvement. You don't get to make demands or ultimatums. And most importantly, you don't get to disappear again if it gets difficult or messy or inconvenient. If you come into their lives, you stay in their lives. No matter what." He nodded eagerly, relief washing over his features. "Of course. Absolutely. Whatever you think is best." She raised a hand to stop him. "I haven't agreed to anything yet. I need time to think about this, to consider what's best for my children. And you need to talk to your wife. This affects her and your son, too." "I will," he promised. "I'll tell her everything tonight. And then, when you're ready, when you've decided, you can call me." She nodded, already mentally preparing for the conversation she would need to have with her children, the careful way she would need to introduce the concept of their father's return. "I should go," she said, gathering her bag. "Sarah's watching the kids, and I promised I wouldn't be long." Marcus stood as she did, uncertainty written across his features. "Thank you," he said again, "for hearing me out, for even considering this." She looked at him, this man who had once been the center of her world, who had shattered that world and left her to rebuild it alone. She had loved him once, had imagined spending her life with him. Now he was a stranger, a man she barely recognized, connected to her only through the 3 small people who carried both their blood. "I'm not doing it for you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm doing it for them. Remember that." As she walked away, leaving him standing by the table with his cooling coffee, Eliza felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Not the entire burden she had carried for 4 years, but a portion of it. Whatever she decided, whatever came next, she had faced a man who had abandoned her and held her ground. She had spoken her truth, had advocated for her children, had shown strength where once there had been only pain. It was a beginning, perhaps, not of forgiveness. She wasn't sure she would ever fully forgive Marcus for what he had done, but of healing, of closure, of a path forward that might, in time, lead to something better for her children. And for now, that was enough.